Hi, I'm Rachel with Patterns and Pixels Canada, and on today's video, I finished sewing together my curved seams quilt. Let's get started. It's been a few weeks since the last time you saw me working on my curved seams quilt, and I'm sure the first thing that you've noticed is that it's a lot bigger than what it used to look like. I've had to move the camera back all the way to the wall just to be able to get the whole quilt in the shot. My design wall is an 8-foot square. So my quilt right now, not taking into account obviously seam allowances, is an 8-foot square. And I ended up enlarging it for one very simple reason. I wanted to get all of my curved blocks onto the front of my quilt. I did that with the original size, which had come to, where's the seam? I think it had come to about here, to 3 of my boards, not the whole 4th. As soon as I put all of these curved seams, squares, blocks, up onto the design wall, I then lost the pathways. And I really wanted to have those included. So to fit all of these and to maintain my pathways, the quilt had to grow. Now there were a few blocks that have been excluded for very simple reasons. They had very large sections of just one color, especially this cream. It really stood out to me when I was looking at the quilt. And there was one, I think I had mentioned in the previous video. Yeah, this one. A big section of the pink, which is fine on its own, but because I've got this pink pathway, it just didn't work. So I've got a few blocks that I didn't include on the front purely because they have one large section of one color, and it just wasn't working for me. But I will use those on the back when I come to do the backing. I'm thinking I might just have them like running as a strip down the center, or maybe a little offset. Haven't quite decided yet. That will probably be determined based on the backing fabric that I choose, which I haven't done yet. In terms of what else I've changed since the last time you saw this quilt, I decided that as best as possible, I wanted to have all of my seams running horizontally. I did initially see about having my blocks turned so that my seams were following this sort of diagonal direction I have going with the quilt, but I found it was, I don't know, too matchy or too linear, having everything go that way. I needed a contrast, and simply by turning the blocks and trying as hard as I could to get the seams to go horizontally, I feel it gives it a bit of dimension. It doesn't work for all of the blocks. There's this one up here. That seam won't turn the other way. So there's a few that are like that. This one has both. It has a horizontal seam and it has one that's following the diagonal of my pathway. But on a whole, everything else has worked well. Once I got them up in this larger format, I took a picture, changed it to grayscale, and then found my light and dark values. I've discovered that this pattern here is really dark. It came out almost as like a black square when I changed it to grayscale. So I made sure that they were evenly dispersed amongst the quilt as best as possible. And then obviously ones that had a lot of white in them would be ones that showed up as very light. And so I wanted to spread those out as well as best as possible in the quilt. And that was a couple of days of work to get everything to do what I wanted there. I'm happy with it now. And so the next step is obviously to sew everything together. I'll be doing it on a diagonal. So I'll be treating each of these rows as the rows of my quilt that get sewn together. So I'll sew all of these blocks to each other and have my long rows. Then I will start at the top and sew them together coming down. Normally, I would take an entire row off the design wall, take it over to my sewing machine, and sew it together and put the row back up. I'm very worried about accidentally turning a block, one of these ones, and then having the seam run the wrong way. So I know it's slower and more labor intensive, but I'm actually only going to come up to the board and get 2 blocks at a time. And I guess that'll be my steps for today, going back and forth from the board to the sewing machine to get each of my rows done. But I'd rather do that than put up a row and find I've sewn a block the wrong way around. That's the other thing I'm going to do. Now that I'm 100% happy with this, I'm going to take a picture. Just in case anything goes wrong, I can refer back to the photo and see if I've moved anything around. At this size, this quilt is going to be closer to a king size than it is a queen, which I don't have a problem with that, excepting I don't have a king size bed. So we'll see how it looks once I have it finished. I haven't 100% decided on my binding yet, but I think I might actually be going with no binding, as it were, the one where you just fold it over onto the back and you don't see it on the front. I could do like a soft pastel kind of color. I don't want to go white or black or anything like that, but I don't want to suddenly have like a border around the outside. I like the way it looks like this, and I don't want to add another color. And even if I used one of these solids that I have here, that would still be a lot of that. And I did briefly consider doing my binding where I've got all 3 of those colors. But I think it will detract from the center of my quilt. I don't want my eye to be drawn to the binding. Having said all of that, I'm liable to change my mind when I get to the point that I'm actually putting the binding on. But for right now, I think I'll do the one where I can't see the binding. I haven't even thought about backing fabric yet, other than to know that I'm going to be putting those blocks into the back. That's it. The next part of this video is just going to be me sewing together all of these blocks. It will take a long time to do it. But at the end, I'll be finished my curved seams quilt. Yay! All right, let's get started. It's been a few days since the last clip that I did. I have finally finished sewing all of my rows to one another, and I've pressed all of my seams alternating ways so that when I come to sewing each of them to one another, I'll be able to nest my seams. Before I start that process though, I wanted to show you what I ended up having to do on the side here. For any of my eagle-eyed viewers, you would have noticed in the sped up clip that I did that at about the 4th row, suddenly the blocks changed. And that's because that was when I realized I had done something wrong. Problem is I didn't know what it was. I just knew something was wrong. So, like every good new quilter, I called my mom. And she immediately knew what I had done wrong. Let me just grab one of my blocks. These are the blocks I've been using, 8-inch squares. And for all of my corners, my edges, I had just simply folded these in half and cut them and put them on. Of course, that doesn't take into account any of my seam allowances. And as soon as I was sewing them on, they weren't reaching right to the edge. And I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was. And thankfully, with her being an experienced quilter, she was able to explain that I need to have my side setting triangles be a lot larger than what I might initially think based on my block to take into account those seam allowances. So before I go ahead and start sewing all of these rows together to finish my quilt, I'm going to take a minute to show you how to do side setting triangles. This is the last row that I need to sew for my quilt. I will have 2 side setting triangles and 1 corner triangle. I'm going to push this off to the side for just a moment to show you a little book that I have that shows the calculations for figuring this out. These can also be found online fairly readily. I'm just getting to the page that has the side setting triangle blocks. The calculation that you do, no matter the size of your quilt, is the same. You take the size of your block, multiply it by 1.414, and then add 1.25 inches for the seam allowance. For my work, that would mean that I need a block that is 12.53 inches square. Because I'm new to this, I decided to round up significantly and make a 13-inch block just to be absolutely sure that I have enough leeway if I make a mistake. Before I decided to cut my real fabric, as it were, I got some scrap fabric from my stash and experimented with that. This is the 13-inch block that I had cut. And you do cut it into 4s when you're ready. And herein lieth the problem that I had. I had already cut all of the fabric that I wanted to use into 8-inch blocks. I had nothing large enough to make a 13-inch square, which means I had to be extra creative and work out what I could do with just my 8-inch block. I ended up taking 2 of my triangular pieces and playing around with them on another scrap piece of fabric and sewing them together into this shape, which gets me the size that I need. This step should be avoided if you plan your side setting triangles before you cut all your fabric. But if, like me, you just went and cut a bunch of 8-inch square blocks without taking into account the fact that you will need some bigger ones for your side setting triangles, then you end up in this situation. So to finish the row, the last row that I have to work on, and I need to make triangles of this size, I'm going to take the one that I have here. I'm going to cut it in half on a diagonal. It's very difficult cutting on a diagonal when I'm also on an angle because of the stand of the camera. There we go. And then I just turn them, which obviously will give me a seam down the middle, but more importantly, it'll get me the size I need. Obviously, this triangle is even larger than I need. I had considered trimming them down before stitching them to my blocks. And then I thought, you know what? Let's leave them giant and they will be helpful when I come to squaring up the fabric, just in case I've made any other mistakes. So I'm going to head over to the sewing machine now. I'm going to get this piece sewn. I will also cut and sew the one on the other side. I'll do this one as well. And then I'll come back to the camera and show you the next step for the corner piece. There's the final row sewn together. You can see the seam in each of these where I opened the triangle, or sorry, I opened the square and stitched the two triangles together. And then obviously sewed them onto my block. Now clearly, there we go, they are substantially larger than what I need for this piece. But again, because of some other mistakes I've made, instead of trimming them now, I've sewn them on at their full size, and they will be trimmed as I square the block, thereby leaving me as much room for error as possible. The last piece I have to do is my corner triangle. And again, I can head over to that same book and get to the corner setting triangle blocks. Calculation is very similar. For this one, you take the finished block size and divide it by 1.414 and then add 0.875 for the seam allowance. Now, in my case, that calculation would end up giving me a 6.5 inch block. I wanted to be generous to myself and round up to 7 inches. And then I thought, well, you know what? My block is already 8 inches. I'm not going to trim this down to 7 inches just to then cut it in half for my triangle. So I'm going to leave it at the 8 inches. I'm going to cut it in half on a diagonal, and I will stitch it across the bottom. Obviously, this is where trimming is going to happen, or squaring up is going to happen. I'm not worried that it's not lining up here, because I know that if I were to cut and trim everything to match, this wouldn't happen. I just have an overly large piece of fabric at the moment, just to allow myself wiggle room. So I'm going to get this final row made and back on my design board, and then I can start actually sewing all the rows together and finish this quilt. Yay! Finished. It's a bit big. I think there we have it. All right. That was a lot of work to get that all sewn together. It will now be set aside for a while I decide exactly how I want to quilt it. I have no idea at the moment, but that will be a project for a different day. For now, if you've enjoyed what I'm doing, the best thing that you can do to help me out is show support on my channel by hitting that like, subscribe, and bell notification. Bye.